Hey guys, and welcome back to yet another GCSE revision video. Now, I've got the lovely Mr. Sally's
and my spatula
and his spatula, and we're going to be going over our GCSE predictions for Christmas Carol, and this is the 2025 edition, which is of course going to be in just over a few weeks from today. So what we're going to be doing is going over, as we've done in past prediction videos, literally the past questions from 2017 all the way to 2024, just to see if there's a trend, right, a pattern, and then go over quick ideas on how to answer those questions and some of the ideas that cropped up in past exams. But of course, then we're going to talk about our predictions and what we think is going to come up in this exam. And by the way, guys, don't forget that I'm going to be doing my final Christmas Carol GCSE Easter class on the 8th of April, and we're going to be going over how to write a model answer for the 2022 exam. This is a follow-up to the previous masterclasses where we went over 2024 and 2023 model answers. And of course, guys, make sure you join in so that you can know how to actually apply the stuff that we're going to be going over into an actual model essay. So let's begin. In terms of Christmas Carol, let's first talk about what came up in the 2024 paper. And this question presented students an extract from Stage 4 where you had The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come with Scrooge. And the question was how Dickens presents the lessons Scrooge learns about life. Of course, this extract obviously shows him the effects of his greed, the effects of his miserly attitude, and we can also see by this stage in the novel that Scrooge has actually started to become a very redemptive figure as he tries to beg the ghost for forgiveness. And of course, this part of the extract, or this part of the novel, is great in terms of either contrasting how he completely transforms and changes in Stage 5, or of course how he's presented as very miserly, very isolated and very lonely in Stage 1. When it comes to this kind of question, what would you suggest in terms of students taking the grades up?
So it's easy to follow Scrooge's journey. So one way to take your grades up is to always focus on the ending. I do that with every text, but actually with Christmas Carol, the ending's got so much in it. Like you could literally write an essay on the last page. So look at the changes at the end when, as you say, he's redemptive. But the other thing is to think, why has why has Dickens created him to have this redemption? Many people think the redemption isn't realistic. You know, he's going to go back to his old miserly ways. But I don't think that is Dickens' message. Dickens' message is Scrooge represents what society is like. Society supports the poor laws. It supports this idea that the poor are idle and deserve to be punished. And so he's writing the book to change his readers' minds, because he knows most of his readers will think about the poor like Scrooge does. When he can show that Scrooge changes, he's saying to his readers, you can all change, let's make a better society. Interestingly, I read hundreds of grades 7 to 9 essays, and as soon as you use the word society, you started at grade 7.
Yeah. That's actually one of the things that I was always talking to my GCSE masterclass about, the buzzwords, right? Yeah. Society, patriarchy. Yes. Are there any other key buzzwords that, you know, especially for students that are doing a Christmas Carol, is great when the moment examiners see that, yes, they're like, okay, this student clearly knows what they're talking about. They also clearly understand Dickens's message. So
the other word is Malthusian.
Okay.
So Malthus was the economist who said, the poor are taking all our resources, and so that's why Scrooge has this view about they had better die, meaning we're better off without them. That comes from Malthus, who was an economist at the time, and that led to the poor laws. So if you're writing about Malthus's views, that's another buzzword.
Yeah, and the other one actually, which we've already mentioned and not said explicitly, is the idea of just him being a redemptive character.
Yes.
Redemption, right? Which ties both to a theme, but actually just showing your understanding of Scrooge's character as he's presented by Dickens.
Superb.
So, for the 2023 question, what came up then?
So, we had the effects of greed there. A theme question. Now, theme questions are, in theory, easier for you to get high marks in because you're automatically writing about the author's ideas. You know, why is Dickens interested in describing the effects of greed? You will lose marks if you just write about Scrooge. You will gain marks if you think, well, why is he presented as this horrible miser? And so for me, Scrooge, although he's a horrible miser, the things he does are actually just what any employer would do. So when he pays Bob Cratchit 15 shillings a week, that's actually the going rate at the time. So although he's a horrible miser, he's still paying what employers pay. And Dickens' point is, look, employers are effectively misers because there are so many people, because of industrialisation, flooding into the city. You can afford to pay them very little because there's thousands of people desperate for jobs. And Dickens' point is, well, that's not fair. Let me prove it. Let's go and visit the Cratchits in Stave 3 and show the consequence of greed. You've got a family where they're all working and they can barely fund a Christmas meal. So going in at that level, what's Dickens up to? What's his message? Easy way to get grade 7 and above.
Yeah, and I think also greed, you could also contrast how Scrooge is presented as a very greedy character in addition to Marley. Okay, so remember that Marley also says things like mankind was my business.
Yes.
But contrast them with generous characters as well, right? So with this kind of essay question, you can also talk about characters like Fezziwig, right? He's a really great contrast in showing the ideal businessman that Dickens envisioned his readers would be. Remember that his readers are people of leisure. They were all business people. It was priced deliberately to be quite expensive. And so you can contrast characters who were generous versus those who were greedy.
Nice
right?
one. Yeah.
Now, when it came to the 2022 question, this was yet another Stave 2 question. In fact, actually, AQA loved taking extracts from Stave 2 for 3 years in a row. Now, this question is to do with how Dickens presents the effects of loneliness and isolation. And of course, with this kind of question, which was taken and showing Scrooge as a young schoolboy completely isolated, here we can see him being presented as a very sympathetic character because we can see how he, as a child, he eventually evolved to someone who was as solitary as an oyster. But also the causes, so we first see the causes of his effects in isolation, but equally, the other side of it is this idea of how his greed, his actions also consequently isolate him from others in society. And one of the things that you can tie this to is how family is an antidote to this, right? So in contrast to Scrooge is presented as this very lonely child, and also as an adult he's presented as this very lonely man. You see scenes, for example, from the Cratchit family dinner, scenes with Belle's home, and we can see here the difference between Scrooge, who becomes very lonely and isolated, versus people like Belle and Cratchit, is because they do not have this excessive focus on money and wealth. What's the way to approach this question?
Yeah, so again, you're going in with loneliness and isolation. You're thinking, well, why is Dickens bothering with this? The obvious one, which you've covered, is we've got to have a psychological reason for Scrooge to become such a miser. Otherwise, he's just like a caricature, a comic figure. Yeah, so one of the ghost of Christmas Past, says to him, that child is there still. And he's saying to Scrooge, that child, that lonely child is still inside you. That's the reason you are like you are. But the other thing is, this for me is a novel about fatherhood. So the isolation is caused by Scrooge's father. Scrooge's father has abandoned him. And even when he comes back to the house, when Fan says you can come back now, there's no mention of the father. All the father has done is stop being cruel, but he hasn't given Scrooge any love. And we're both very fond of contrasting the beginning to the end. At the ending of the novel, he becomes a second father to Tiny Tim. And that's the big transformative moment for him. And it links straight back to your idea, the way to overcome this is through family. But the role that Scrooge has to take on is a father figure. And if we think about his intentions, we're going back to the idea of greed again. He has got to become a father figure to the poor. That's why he gives so much to charity, and that's why he raises Bob's salary. Dickens' message, we've all got to treat the poor like that. We can't just dismiss them as a problem that will hopefully go away and they'll die because they're malnourished.
So, 2021, what question came up?
So this was ideas about joy and happiness. This is actually a really hard question.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to find lots of descriptions of the joy. We've talked about Fezziwig, we've talked about Cratchit's Family Christmas. We can talk about the ending, but so what? Like, who cares? Why is he doing it? Well, if we come back to your idea of contrast all the time, he's contrasting life as it really is for many people, and then life as it should be. So we look at the Cratchits, they're in such poverty that Tiny Tim's going to die, and yet they still find joy and happiness despite all their poverty. Imagine what a great life we could give them by just paying them a little bit more, which is why he decides to save Tiny Tim's life. The joy comes from giving. Scrooge is the happiest man in the world at the end of the novel because he's now giving to other people. That's why Dickens has set this story at Christmas, and he's publishing the book at Christmas as well because he wants his readers to make that connection. You get more joy and more happiness by giving to other people. Come on, it's Christmas.
Okay, so for the 2020 question, this was an extract taken from Stave 3 with Ignorance and Want, and the question was to do with how Dickens presents the suffering of the poor. This is a great theme question on the theme of poverty. There's so much you can talk about with this. There's so many points you can make in terms of, firstly, how Dickens, in terms of his message, he was criticizing the behavior of most industrial businessmen during the Industrial Revolution. He was also using this novel as a way to convey a frightening religious message to these people that the consequences of increasing and amplifying the suffering of the poor is that in the afterlife they're going to be like Marley, right? But the other side of it, especially when you think about if you were presented a poverty question, what could you talk about? You want to also talk about how the poor are presented almost as these enlightened figures, these figures who actually seem to be quite much more spiritually rich, right? So even if, for example, Ignorance and Want are shown to criticize, the consequences of Scrooge's behavior and actions of businessmen, which lead to children not having enough education, not having enough basic needs, right? Actually, also when you're thinking about the other side of the suffering of the poor, whilst they suffer materially in terms of not having a lot of money, actually they're presented as quite happy, right? The Cratchit family are seen as a unit, a family unit together, in contrast to rich people like Scrooge, who are actually deeply unhappy. And of course, remember that Dickens's message is two-pronged, right? On the one hand, he's criticizing businessmen as causing and amplifying these class divisions, the suffering of the poor. But on the other hand, also, he presents the poor as almost being more meek and also being much more closer to God, right? So there's two aspects and two ways you can approach this question. Now, how would you approach, and what would be perhaps your suggestions for a question of this nature where you've got ignorance and want?
So, well, the interesting thing about Ignorance and Want is ignorance. So ignorance is the one with doom written across his brow, and Dickens at the time wanted to write a pamphlet about educating the poor, but he needed money. He got some investments, he'd been to America, and he was short of cash, so he thought, I've got to write a bestseller. It took him 30 days to write this book, right? And so he scrapped the pamphlet, but you can see the pamphlet leaking out here. Ignorance and Want, like, if they never appeared in the story, no one would care. Doesn't change the plot at all. They're only there to get across his message. If we don't educate the poor, ignorance represents education. If we don't educate the poor, there's going to be doom. Like, society is going to be much worse. And so this is his way of getting the idea that we've got to focus on the children. And that's, of course, is why Scrooge focuses on Tiny Tim. Children of the future. If we change the way we think about the poor, treat them as our children, society will be so much better.
Okay, so 2019, Stave 1 with Marley's Ghost. What came up with that?
Yeah, so this is a really hard one to do well, because you're thinking, obviously, what are the ghosts there for? They're just there to change Scrooge. And it's quite easy then to start describing all the ways that Scrooge changes. But that's only going to get you to grade 6. You've got to think, okay, well, what's the point? Well, the point is the same as the lessons that Scrooge learned right at the beginning. Okay. The ghosts are only there to deliver that message. But the ghosts are also, interestingly, pagan figures. So we think, oh, well, it's Christmas. This should be a Christian novel. redemption is a Christian idea, but actually, if you look at the description of the ghost of Christmas Past, it's a pagan figure. And it's quite interesting that I think Dickens is saying, look, the need to change and look after people is so ancient it even predates Jesus Christ. You know, this is something that we should be doing as humans, and it should be our instinct to help the poor, and therefore he uses the ghosts to criticise society because we don't.
Yeah, so just to be clear also, of course, the 2019 question was how Dickens uses the ghost to help Scrooge change his attitude and behaviour. And from what I'm gathering, even if the extract was purely to do with Marley's ghost, the discussion can be broader than just Marley's ghost, right? So you first start off with Marley, but then also, as you've mentioned, talk about how the other ghostly figures are used, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
So the 2018 exam was Stave 4, so again this is the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, and the question was how Dickens presents Scrooge's fears. Now I would say this question is fairly straightforward, but actually it's deceptively easy. In other words, one of the things that students tend to do with slightly more straightforward questions here, so for example the extract, it's showing that Scrooge, I fear you more than any spectre I've seen, then students what they'll do is start just describing, oh, Scrooge is shown as being really fearful because you can see that he sees the ghost, it represents death, he's really scared, blah 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 blah. And all that does is just talk about, in very shallow analysis, just what's presented, just basically describing what's happening in the novel. Now when you think about Scrooge's fears, you always need to remember, and this by the way is for any Christmas Carol question. Again, I'm going to be emphasizing this in my GCSE Christmas Carol masterclass on the 8th of April. Okay, this is going to be a one-off Easter revision class. When you are answering any Christmas Carol question, you always need to move quickly beyond describing, this is what's happening in the extract, oh, Scrooge is shown as being really, really fearful. You then need to go straight into Dickens's message. Scrooge's fears, in terms of Dickens's message, is his fears of the afterlife, his fears of being beyond redemption, his fears of facing the same fate as Jacob Marley as a result of his sinful actions of greed in the current life. Equally, when you're thinking about Scrooge's fears, you can also broaden that out, right? You can talk about how Scrooge's fears are presented in terms of, number one, wanting to be a redemptive character. Number two, also his fears of isolation, his fears of continued isolation and even in death, his fears of all that he's worked for being stolen, being desecrated, which is what he sees also in that same state, right? And of course, these fears, what are the consequences of his fears? Now, this is where you have a nice contrast you can talk about. And when you're writing any essay, you must contrast. Again, I'm going to be talking about this lots when I do my GCSE masterclass on Christmas Carol during Easter time. Always contrast how he shifts from being a fearful character and a fearful person in Stave 4 when he sees and he feels like his fate is sealed with the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, to Stave 5 where he is seen as really overjoyed. He is given another chance at redemption, and we can see here that his fears drive him to change. How would your approach, would it differ in terms of this kind of question?
Well, it would slightly differ. So I agree with everything you said, and you keep coming back to the idea of contrast, which I love, looking at the differences in the characters. But for me, the contrast I'm going for is, yes, he's deeply afraid, but I don't think that's what causes him to change. I think the change happens in Stave 3, when he asks the ghost of Christmas present, is Tiny Tim going to live? So suddenly he feels responsible for Tiny Tim. And then the other change is when he sees ignorance and want and realises that there are massive consequences if he doesn't change, not just to Tiny Tim, but to society. So I think he actually changes after Stave 3, and this kind of fear here is to entertain the readers, because it's a ghost story at Christmas, and we haven't had a scary ghost yet, so we need a scary ghost. But the important thing about this ghost is this is the ghost that Scrooge is able to convince, let me have another chance. He doesn't want that other chance because he's now scared of what the ghost has shown him. He's scared of, if I don't change, Tiny Tim's going to die.
Okay, and so final question.
2017. So how Dickens uses the Cratchit family to show the struggles of the poor. This is a complete gift of a question, because you start with writing about the characters. They're in the extract that you're given. It's the Christmas that the Cratchits are having. But then the question says, we want to give you higher marks. Can you link it to Dickens' ideas about the poor? Yes, I can. And we've shown you all the way through here how you can link it to his ideas about the poor. You're going to sprinkle in that word Malthus or Malthusian. You're going to write about Dickens' desire to make society treat the poor with care rather than the way they do. Scrooge's redemption represents that. So this is an absolute gift of a question, and I wish that AQA still did that, if they still gave you a way to talk about Dickens' ideas in the question.
Okay. So prediction time,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So as you guys can see, there's literally color coding here, where blue represents when a question's come up related to a character, and red represents theme. So based on what you can see here, from 2017 all the way to 2024, what do you think is a pattern that maybe AQA might follow in the upcoming 2025 exam?
So I've got two ways of answering this. So I polled my viewers, and they said, we think it's going to be Scrooge and Redemption. And I think it's going to be a family sort of question, focusing either on the Cratchits or just generally family linked to the poor. I think this one, the poverty in the family, is going to come up again. I hope so, but because that's the one that's going to be easiest to get top marks in. Okay,
well, I think definitely a Scrooge question is on the cards, right? There haven't been actually very many Scrooge or character questions. There's only actually been just one Scrooge, then Ghost, then we've got Scrooge here again. So Scrooge has only come up as a character just twice. I think potentially AQA might be quite kind enough to bless you guys with a Scrooge question. I think if a Scrooge question were to come up, it would be something to do with rather than redemption, perhaps charity, right?
Yes, yeah.
So I think perhaps a Scrooge question, but related to charity. However, if it was strictly and purely a theme question, so say for example, if one of these ones just came up by itself, I'm going to kind of be a little bit out there and suggest perhaps the theme of family, or even just the theme of charity by itself, right?
Yeah.
So I think either a Scrooge question is going to come up if a character comes up again, or either a charity or family theme question will come up for this year's 2025 exams. And of course, guys, for those of you that want to see how to apply all the stuff that we talked about, and also actually, because what I'm going to be doing in my upcoming Christmas Carol GCSE Easter class, I'm going to be going over predictions and essay structures. If one of my predictions comes up, obviously if you join in that Christmas Carol GCSE masterclass, you'll literally know how to answer that, and have also your own very well written grade 9 model essay that you can use to revise from. So that's it. Thank you so much, guys, for watching.